Good morning, everyone. Welcome. So we'll get going, 11:33. I hope lots of our participants are there. Good morning and welcome to this webinar on uplifting women's voice and leadership in crisis, how the UK can seize opportunities for impactful climate finance. I'm so pleased to be joined by an impressive panel of speakers today, and I will briefly go around and introduce them. So I have David Bailey, Head of Global Finance Department, FCDO. Welcome, David. I have Cynthia McDougall, Senior Research Fellow in Gender, Environment and Development from the Stockholm Environment Institute. Welcome, Cynthia. I have Care Nepal Country Director Mona Sherpa from Care Nepal. Thank you, Mona. And I have Twongirwe Ireen, Executive Director of Women for Green Economy Movement in Uganda. Welcome, Ireen. So it's great to have you all with us, and I'm really excited to hear your perspectives on this important topic. So before we get going, a little bit of housekeeping. We're recording today's session, as you can see. So we're able to share it afterwards with all of you and anyone else who is keen to hear these perspectives. And after our speakers have shared their thoughts, there'll be time at the end for Q&A. You will see a Q&A box in the Zoom. If you would like to share questions at any point, please pop them in the Q&A box, and then we'll endeavour to answer as many of them as possible in our last 15-20 minutes today. So why are we focusing on this topic? For Care International, this is a topic that we think is critical for all our futures. Climate change is sexist. Marginalised women and girls in the global south who have done the least to cause climate change are the ones most impacted. They face increasing food security, gender-based violence, unpaid care, and their livelihoods are often reduced or destroyed as a result of the climate crisis. And these impacts are worse if you're also facing other inequalities: age, race, disability, gender identity, and sexuality. It's really a matter of climate justice that women and girls are prioritised in our response. Women and girls in all their diversity have the power, expertise, resilience, and ability to adopt and lead the solutions their communities so desperately need. CARE's evidence shows that when supported to lead, women take collective action to address the injustice and community tensions, solve problems, deliver services, and influence improved climate and humanitarian responses. The previous government made some fantastic commitments to gender in the International Women and Girls Strategy and also in the International Climate Finance Strategy. It was very strong on paper, but unfortunately the practice has not lived up to the promises. Our research last year found that just 0.2% of UK bilateral climate finance reaches women's rights organisations. And that definition includes organisations like UN Women, who are not just grassroots organisations. We also found that less than 1% of bilateral funding is targeted at gender equality specifically. The Independent Commission for Aid Impact, ICAI, this year also called on the UK to do better at integrating gender equality into climate finance. So I think it's fair to say we have a way to go. But there are opportunities. We have a new government in the UK that has said it will be proudly feminist. So we're hoping to see a much more ambitious approach in relation to gender and climate in our climate policies, the new climate finance goal to be agreed at COP, in the development of the next UK climate finance strategy, and through the International Development Review. Before we turn to our speakers, we'd like to find out what you think now about the impact of women's voice and leadership in climate action. So we have a survey tool, which is called Metimeter. So my trusty assistants are going to share the Metimeter survey with you now. So you should be seeing that. You're going to get a message from Metimeter now inviting you to open the app. You can either answer the question by clicking open, or you can scan the QR code on the screen. It should be very straightforward, and you will get 3 boxes where you can put a word, a phrase, or indeed a sentence. I think it gives you up to 25 words per box. And we're going to get in a minute a little word cloud here that picks up your responses. So I'll give you a minute to fill that in. I'm hoping that's working. Here we go. We're getting some responses. Wonderful. So what is the impact of women's voice and leadership in climate action? So climate action is more sustainable. We think it is more just and effective. Wow, that's fantastic. Give that another 30 seconds. So yes, so effective, justice, and sustainable, and it has an impact on gender equality, robust gender equality. That's wonderful. Thank you everyone for responding. It'll be interesting to see if your views change as we go through the discussion today. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our first speaker. Ireen is a climate activist, community organizer, mobilizer, and executive director of Women for Green Economy movement in Uganda. She's trained climate and gender activist with experience across different geographies and cultures. Her work and passion focuses on the interconnections between movement strengthening, feminist influencing, women organizing, and building narrative power through collective action. A huge amount of things to really create change. Ireen has also championed the Stop East African Crude Oil Pipeline campaign in Uganda, empowering marginalized women to push for renewable energy and other green economic alternatives that are sustainable. I can't think of anyone better to come first in our panel today, Ireen. So I'm going to hand over to you to share your thoughts with us on what you found to be the impact of women's voice in leadership in climate action, and how should grassroots women's voices be reflected in national and international spaces. Thank you. Over to you, Ireen.
Thank you so much. How to amplify women voices in climate action. To deliver inclusive and equitable climate action, we need to amplify women voices. And how can we do this? We need to do it through empowering marginalized women to embrace storytelling as a tool. Marginalized women sharing their experience, creating resilience among themselves, and giving themselves psychological support through radical healing. And we also need to empower them through use of art, through school debates and fashion, both in school and community, and then supporting marginalized women with their locally led solutions. This will not only help in conservation of environment or in promoting climate justice, but also to empower women economically. Yeah, next slide. So how grassroots women contribute to climate action is that we use indigenous knowledge to contribute to climate justice. And this is through water harvesting. When it's rainy season, women use the indigenous knowledge through water harvesting, agroecology or agriculture, and the small farming planning. And we also contribute through starting up eco-friendly businesses that contribute to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. These businesses, women are empowered to start up saving groups to empower them economically. We all know that there is no climate justice without climate finance. So women increase climate finance through starting up eco-friendly businesses, and also education and awareness building. When women also contribute into awareness building, we know that they are the caretakers of families. So they educate their children, they educate their husband, they educate everyone in the community to have a great impact or knowledge about climate change. And then engaging them, it will also help in renewable energy solutions. We know women are key players of renewable energy technologies. They are the ones that are affected by energy poverty, so they have the knowledge to use alternatives such as briquettes or biomass as an alternative to reduce on the level of deforestation. Next slide. The impact of women voices and leadership in climate spaces. It is very vital that women's leadership brings diverse perspectives, fosters inclusive decision making, and enhances community resilience. Therefore, this will bring inclusivity and intersectional perspectives. The marginalized community, the indigenous people, the vulnerable women that are not addressed or represented. While women engage in climate spaces, they will address the unaddressed challenges, the intersectionality of climate change and health. They will be on board and they will be recognized. Then it will also strengthen community resilience and adaptation. In this, while women are engaging in climate spaces, they will bring the building of women, movement of women to build the resilience, to share their stories on how they can contribute to reduce on climate crisis, or on how they can contribute on climate adaptation. And then while women are engaged in climate spaces, it will bring about climate and gender justice. Our voices are going to be heard, are going to be addressed, and are going to be implemented with our demands. We all know that women are problem solvers, so we work through collaboration, not only in families, but also in community, to increase in decision making. Next slide. So how we should increase our voices into national and international spaces is that we need the capacity building and leadership movement of community-based monitors at the grassroots level. We also need local to global networks, funding and financial support to help implement the locally led solutions. Mentorship and collaboration. The UK government, the new government that is coming in, has to emphasize on bringing on board the grassroots women to these international spaces to share their stories, to share the impact, to share the challenges, and also to share the solutions that they are doing at grassroots. That is the exchange learning from grassroots to national and international spaces. Then advocacy training through participatory research. Community-based organizations should also engage in research to make sure that they give out evidence-based data, from the communities. And then we also need to embrace the digital media, or empowering women through media as a tool to amplify our voices into this national and international space. Next slide. Next slide. So as an organization, this is the work that we are doing. We are carrying out school strikes. We are campaigning against the Stop ECOP campaign. Next slide. We are making sure that we give radical healing, we give confidence to the marginalized women to continue the fight of climate justice. Next slide. And then engaging with communities, engaging with international organization. Next slide. Last year I was at COP, so I was representing my community on how we are doing to contribute to climate justice and how it is important to address our issues from the grassroots level. Yeah, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Irene. I think that the point about bringing women in, bringing these grassroots organizations and their leaders into the conversation to inform the policy is really well made. Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Cynthia McDougall, who joins us from the Stockholm Environment Institute. Cynthia joined SEI in November 2021 as a senior research fellow. She leads the Gender, Environment and Development team in Asia and co-leads SEI's global program on gender equality, social equity and poverty. No small task. An interdisciplinary social scientist with over 20 years of experience in gender, social equity and inclusion in natural resource governance and food systems research. It's great to have you with us today, Cynthia. I know you recently conducted research on the barriers and enabling factors to women's voice and leadership in climate decision-making. I'd love you to share the main findings from your research and what you see as the implications for policymakers and program designers, like many of the people with us today in the webinar. So, thanks, Cynthia.
Great. Thank you so much, Helen. And warm greetings to everyone who's joined today. It's such a pleasure to be part of today's exciting webinar. So what I wanted to jump on with my 7 minutes is the question of gender equitable climate adaptation decision-making. Are we there yet? There's obviously been a ton of investment, but the question is, how are we doing in actually making progress towards this goal? So it's just a little sticky with the advancing. So I'm going to be sharing based on a study that SEI in Bangkok had the pleasure of doing in collaboration with CARE and Fondation L'Oréal, entitled Breaking the Barriers. And so just to recognize my wonderful colleagues and co-authors on this. And the report isn't available yet, but it will be very soon. It'll be launched this month. The study looked at the global level, the national level, and did a case study in Vietnam. And so I wanted to just leap right into, okay, in these few minutes, if I only had 3 messages to share, what would they be? The first one relates to the headline question of, okay, are we there yet? And I'm going to just give it all away in a word. The answer is no, we're not at gender equitable decision-making. Systemic inequities exist at all scales, and we'll dig into that. The second key message is about, okay, if that's the case, then why not? And I wanted to signal that the barriers that exist are more than the ones that we often talk about, more than the women's access to information, that kind of thing, access to training. They're interconnected and they're much deeper. So that's that second message, and we'll unpack that. And the third is that question of, okay, so if that's the case, then how do we move forward? And it's a little bit related to this barriers question. I want to propose from the study that we need to look beyond women's capacities and look deeper at addressing capabilities of a range of actors, strengthening systems, and addressing underlying drivers like constraining norms. So let's jump right into that first key message. Is decision-making in climate equitable? The answer is no. And honestly, if I had no other words to show on that from the study, you could just look at the picture, which is a climate forum, and you would see that the answer is there. This is a relatively current picture, and women are still in the minority. From the study, we could see the highlight was, yes, participation was inequitable across all scales, including in leadership roles in particular. And just to bring that home a little bit, in the Vietnam case study, when we asked people across all scales, okay, well, give us one example, describe what was a gender equitable process like, just so we can understand it and what came out of it. And of all the participants, the grand total of people who could do that was 0. Because no one felt that they had ever seen or participated in an equitable climate decision-making process. At the global level, the COPs are a good example. Despite some great commitments to move in the direction of gender equity, we see national party delegates at around 34%, head of delegations even lower at about 19%. This is from the COP28 data. And the trends are relatively flat from last year or even from 10 years ago, flat or ever so slightly decreasing. So although there is commitment, there is not momentum. That's what those stats say to me. At the national and subnational level, we know that globally, representation of women in parliaments tends to be low. For example, India, 15%. What we found in climate decision-making in particular in Vietnam, although Vietnam has quotas and actually does better than many, many countries overall in terms of women's representation in government, with some of the climate relevant ministries, we see numbers like 16%, 0%, and 5% in these central leadership teams. The numbers were higher, however, in civil society organizations, including women-focused networks such as the Vietnam Women's Union, of course. So we go to the local level now, and I wanted to highlight 2 points. And the first, if you look in the corner of the slide, when we talk to people about participation, we wanted to get past that notion that it just means attending or that it just means any one thing. And so that in orange, that's a little bit of a ladder that people described. What are the degrees or steps or rungs on the ladder of participation? And what women reported at the local level was that although almost all women attended, very few of them did understand, share, or felt valued in the meetings. And when we said, okay, well, how many women are influencing these local level climate related decisions? Again, the answer was 0. The second point I won't get into, it was really great that Helen, you highlighted this as well, the intersectional aspect of it, that women are not all one group and that there are great differences, and people who face the highest levels of exclusions tend to be women who are also from marginalized groups, such as in the Vietnam case, ethnic minority groups. And in that case, women self-identified as being on the lowest rung, that attending or barely attending step of the ladder. So in the last couple of minutes, I wanted to just dig into those barriers and just to look under the surface a little bit, to emphasize, as I said in that key message, that it's not about what we can see, the visible thing about, okay, women aren't in trainings or women aren't getting the information, or even just that we're not seeing enough women leaders. It's about the systems that are underneath that and the norms, those the assumptions about what women should do, what men should do, and so forth. And so I'm just going to share quickly a couple of barriers organized into some levels here. And so here, women's access and capacities, this is what's relatively known: language and literacy, education, limited experiences, low confidence. But when we get into the systems level, this tends to be a lot less talked about in my experience. And that's what the study suggested as well, including things like the decision-making processes themselves. If they are traditional, they're more top-down, even more argumentative, they can be exclusionary. We also have in the systems level things like lack of financing and lack of human capacity to facilitate, to lead these more gender responsive and transformative processes. And then at the very base of this, at the very bottom, we have gender and social hierarchies, power relations, and associated norms, those assumptions about what men and women should do. The biases and stereotypes in particular, this idea of men being natural leaders, women being in the natural order of things, caregivers. And those, you can see the bullets just above that, have a whole lot of knock-on effects that then knock on further to constrict women's engagement in leadership and decision-making in climate, including that we found men didn't recognize the biases. They tend to say, well, women should just step up more. The lack of recognition of participation as a right, and early and forced marriages. And then the last slide I wanted to share is ways forward. That was that third message. And in line with what we said about there's a lot of focus on women and the surface level, getting them involved in training and so forth. That is an important level, but we wanted to switch it up a little bit. The study suggested let's look at capabilities, not capacities, and let's look at women's collectives. Irene gave a great example of some of the more collective action, but also let's zoom in on climate decision-making, knowledge, finance, and let's strengthen the capabilities here, not just of women, but capabilities of all leaders of all gender to be more inclusive decision makers and process designers. And let's get the social protection systems right, because if you're not secure in your life and livelihoods, you do not have the luxury of participating or exercising that right. And the last points very quickly, the policies and systems. Quotas, of course, have shown that they're good, but we have to go beyond quotas to look at the decision-making processes themselves and start to channel climate finance towards gender equality, towards equity, towards rights, and towards and through CSOs. And last but not least, let's address those underlying norms that constrain those attitudes and biases by engaging men and women together in bringing these to the surface in climate-related spaces, and see if we can't change things from the bottom up. And let me stop there, and I'll hand back to you, Helen.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. I think you've really laid out for us how challenging it's going to be if we really want to get women's voice and leadership as part of this design and these processes. And we're going to have to do something different, and we're going to have to actively support it, or it will go back to the patriarchal models that are already in place. Thank you so much. I think we're starting to see some questions in the Q&A. Please, if you've got questions, pop them in the Q&A. We'll get to them at the end. Don't put your hand up, because we won't be able to go in and out to take questions via hand. Please put them in the Q&A. The chat doesn't work, I don't think, for participants. It's the Q&A we'd like you to use. Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce CARE's Mona Sherpa, development practitioner and feminist leader with a career of over 2 decades. I had the pleasure of working with Mona when I worked at ActionAid, so it was wonderful to find her with CARE as the country director for CARE Nepal. Mona has played a crucial role in shaping CARE's work and vision in Nepal, but also beyond its boundaries. She is renowned for her thought leadership in localization. She goes beyond partnerships, advocating for norm transformation and fit-for-purpose operations with a focus on women's rights and gender justice. Mona, it's great to have you with us today. Thank you for joining. I'd really appreciate it if you could share how CARE Nepal approaches support for women's voice and leadership in climate action, particularly working with women's rights organisations in a way that is locally led. Thanks, Mona.
Thank you, Helen, and good morning, good afternoon, whichever, good evening, whichever part of the world you are in. And I'm really happy to be here. And Cynthia, I enjoyed listening to you, because many of the things that I was about to tell, actually, you already said it. And then it will just be the reiteration. But the good thing is how research has also paved the same thing and emphasized on the same thing. So it's very helpful. Thank you, and I enjoyed it. Helen, exactly as you said at the very beginning, climate change is sexist. And its impact, it really sits disproportionately on women and girls. And it is not just the environmental crisis, but it is also the gender crisis. And Cynthia has already mentioned, because it is not just about the knowledge or capacity or having lack of information, but it's also the system, and system, not just the legal policy, our governance system, but also our social system, the norms, the underlying causes, which is there, which is very capitalistic, which is very patriarchal, and its characteristics, the duality, its exploitative nature, it sits everywhere. And sad that because of the existing gender power relationship, it works more on women and girls and people from the marginalized community. In Nepal, with its impact, on agriculture, the climate change, Nepal is a mountainous country. And then with this, either too less, it has its impact on several things. But Nepal is an agricultural country. And the impact of climate change on agriculture is huge. And the population, more than 80%, who very much relies on agriculture, now are migrating to the Gulf countries or to the urban centers, town, because there is no possibility in agriculture itself. And as labor, for livelihood, they are going everywhere. And mostly also because of our patriarchal architecture, it's mostly men, which means leaving women, elderly, differently able people, children, and others behind, especially those who are not able to afford to go out or migrate for other livelihood. And they are the ones who are bearing the brunt of different impacts of climate change at the ground. And when you go to community, you see in a form of fallow land or more impact on agriculture, new kind of diseases, or too little water to even irrigate. And then the community who very much relies on agriculture is really having it's burnt mostly. And then you know, if I have to tell you the story from our community where we are working, Bhuti Devi Sadaya from Siraha district is one of those impacted women who became, like, you know, part of CARE's one of the initiative. We call it Rupantaran. Rupantaran means transformation. And being part of the project, she is skilled, she is aware, she is confident with, like, you know, with additional information, the technical climate related information, which we think that they don't have. However, they do hold the indigenous knowledge, as Cynthia and Irene was also mentioning, which is though not regarded as knowledge or information, even in the field of climate, but then they are the ones who actually have it and actually use it. But then she's more informed with these technical informations and has joined community groups of farmers and engaged in climate resilient agriculture practices, several dialogues to engage with community, but also with the local government leaders, farmers association, political parties, politicians, you know, from the local ground, and has contributed with that knowledge and information in drafting or crafting Lapa, Kapa, you know, and also, like, you know, in several government related plans and all. Women and marginalized communities such as poor, Dalit, indigenous groups face higher vulnerabilities due to climate change, and this is due to limited income, lack of ownership of land and property, limited access to credit and markets, and inadequate capacity to diversify livelihood. Women in particular are vulnerable due to their significant role in sectors like agriculture, where they constitute 73% of the workforce, but lack equal access to resources and opportunities as men. And specific climate risks affecting vulnerable groups include increased workload, which Helen was also mentioning, due to drying water resources, loss of access to essential services, be it education, health, water, sanitation, food and nutrition insecurity, displacement, as I mentioned earlier, and increased risk of violence. And I saw Cynthia was also talking about child marriage, early marriage, forced marriage and all. But along with that, also trafficking due to, a climate disaster. So understanding this, you can see the framework that has been put in the screen. CARE uses this gender equality framework, which especially talks about agency, relation, and structure. And we think, like, to make it more systemic, we have to work on various fold. You can't just, like, give additional information capacity or build consciousness and all on women alone, but you also have to work along with that, like where exactly she is going to use that knowledge. So she needs that collective power, and thus, like, relationship at the community level with the local leaders, with other social movements, CSOs, even climate change activists is very important, be it informal or informal or non-formal spheres. But, like, along with the agency and relations, it is equally important that we do some work at the structure level, which is around the social norms, but also the policy and all those things. So CARE Nepal, like, along with the climate finance kind of studies, which definitely showed that donors are over-reporting, like, by saying there is an adaptation fund, actually it is not, which actually doesn't go to women also. But along with that, developing and scaling land and climate models, nutrition sensitive, climate smart, like, community or groups like CLAC, community learning and action groups, climate smart agriculture practices, some policy support, especially Lapa Kapa, where women's voices, the gender equality and social inclusion aspects are also ensured, but also group level, adaptation planning are formed. So that is where CARE has really been, like, emphasizing on. And if you want to know more, I'll definitely give you more information and numbers, or also share our report and all, but like within 7 minutes, I cannot list it out all. However, if I have to tell UK government, like, what they can do, in Nepal, they have some interesting, projects with pounds and pounds, like, really showered around it, like Green Growth Nepal, Nepal in Business, local infrastructure support program, resilience, adaptation, and inclusion in Nepal, which we call RAIN. And those kind of initiatives are there. And those are wonderful because there are adaptation related, resilience related, shock responsive effort, which we have to integrate. But at the same time, what we have noticed is gender equality and social inclusion still remains there as an annex topic, but not something which is included from day one in the entire crafting, to make sure that without working on it and just by making it the annex topic, we are actually not helping in building societal resilience. And that is where I really want UK government to focus on having a very JC responsive adaptation action, see like how local government, all 753 local government, ensures that in their plans, but also as Cynthia was saying, like not just commitment, but also to give momentum. There is a fund, there is an implementation work, there are JC sensitive responsive livelihood programs, invest on that, develop climate data management system, because that also completely skips women and girls, support in national adaptation objectives, even engage with private sector investment related work, so that there also gender equality and social inclusion effort, understanding that we have to work at the agency level, relation level, structure level to have a right kind of solution to it. So David, when you are here, this is my very strong message, that let JC not be annex as it happens all the time. Let donors not over-report on their investment and climate financing, but do it in a right way as they have committed. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you so much, Mona. A very passionate sharing of a perspective from an individual woman's story right through to the whole system, and then a bit of an analysis there on FCDO's work in Nepal. That leads beautifully on to the introduction of our final speaker today, which is David Bailey. David has been a civil servant for 15 years, and in his current role, he is the head of Global Climate Finance Department for FCDO, which covers UK international climate finance and work on reforming and improving access to global finance. David, I imagine it's a busy, demanding time, but hopefully a fascinating moment to be in that role. I'm sure others like Care are keen to find out how you think supporting women's voice and leadership might sit within the UK government's approach to this agenda and furthering it. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. And hello, everybody on the call. Really fantastic to be here. It is a busy time, but I think important to kind of carve out time in our days. I'm sure I'm not the only person on the call who's busy. To discuss these issues, and really invigorating and kind of refreshing to hear the different perspectives already so far. And thank you to Mona for teeing me up so beautifully in terms of her views on the FCDO's work so far. That's great. So I've been working on climate finance for the last 5 years. Mainly been focused on the UK's international climate finance. I joined the team just before we announced the doubling of our climate finance efforts to 11.6 billion, and have worked on that in that area ever since, and recently took on a slightly expanded role to look kind of more widely at climate finance from a global perspective as well. Prior to that, I was part of the UK team in Zimbabwe, working on issues like health, education, water, and that was incredibly eye-opening in terms of climate change and the challenges that people in the developing world in particular, and as we're talking about kind of women, girls, and marginalized groups as well, are really facing on a day-to-day basis. We dealt with drought and food insecurity. We dealt with cholera outbreaks, groundwater depletion. There were climate-linked disasters in the time that I was there, and I was privileged to work really closely with a Zimbabwean colleague who was an absolute expert in kind of climate change and tackling climate change. And it was like I said, it was incredibly eye-opening and has given me a real insight, I think, as I came back to the UK to work in this kind of more central role. So it is a busy time for us. Part of the reason why it's a busy time is, of course, because we have a new government in the UK. I'm sure you're all aware of that, and so that leaves me in a slightly sticky situation, because we are still building an understanding of what their key priorities are, and what their position and policy position is going to be on some key issues. So there will be some issues that I genuinely don't know the answer to, and be some issues where I might know the answer, but I'm not allowed to say it. Because people way more important than me will want to say it themselves in the kind of the event season that we have over the autumn, that I'm sure we all look forward to. But there are some things that we do know. So we know that kind of restoring climate leadership was a significant pledge in the Labour Party manifesto. They've talked a lot about trying to really put the UK at the forefront of leadership in this space. They talk a lot about clean energy and the transition to kind of clean and green energy provision and green economies. And they also talk a lot about women and equality. So I have an actual quote from their manifesto that women's equality will be at the heart of our missions. And by missions is the kind of language of this new government. They want to be a mission-led government. So I think at the outset, those are two extremely positive kind of directions that this government is setting. I think it's worth noting and good to note that the Minister of State for Development is also the Minister of State for Women and Equalities, and I think that demonstrates to a degree an understanding that those two issues are linked. That we're not going to meet our development and poverty reduction and climate goals unless we also are working on equality, and in particular on gender equality, and making sure that women's voice is heard. Another kind of key issue that I think we're really reasonably confident in talking about is the fact that that this government will really want to be pushing kind of partnerships, particularly in the global south. They don't want to, they want to work with the kind of countries that are the recipients of our climate finance and our development finance in partnership, working on kind of local priorities, not imposing our own priorities or our own kind of thoughts and ideas necessarily. And I think it's really clear from some of the presentations we've heard even today. I mean, I think back to kind of the opening and Irene's whirlwind tour of all the things that she and her colleagues are doing in Uganda. The energy, the passion, the ideas are there. And I guess my role and part of my role in working kind of within government is to provide the opportunities for Irene and so many others to kind of outwork their passion, energy, and ideas in a local context. So I think, I mean, reflecting also on the presentations so far this morning have really demonstrated that link between kind of equality, empowerment, and voice, and tackling climate change, have shown and demonstrated again that women and girls are on the front line when it comes to facing the impacts of the climate emergency, and also need to be really clearly on the front line when it comes to finding and working through the solutions at every level, from the kind of the resilience and the household level resilience all the way up to kind of the innovation and the technology. So really quickly, just going on to kind of what that might look like for the UK government. So we're already seeking to be at the forefront of thinking in these areas. We have held several conferences, even recently on, there was one, I think last week, in fact, on gender equality and social inclusion in biodiversity action. Earlier this year on building women's economic empowerment into climate transitions, and really trying to push that kind of thought leadership. So giving academics, giving practitioners, and giving policymakers a chance to come together and think through what it means to empower women and girls and other marginalized groups tackling climate change. We'll look to collaborate. I've already talked about the kind of primacy of partnerships. We're part of the Action Coalition on Feminist Action for Climate Justice. We've endorsed the Gender Responsive Just Transitions Partnership Pledge. We're part of the civil society-led champions group on grassroots gender and just climate financing, and these things. So we want to be, part of this bigger picture, of this bigger architecture around tackling these issues. And then critically, kind of given the title of this event, we do want to put our money where our mouth is, and to make sure that our climate finance is proactively leading to a greater role for women in tackling climate change. Now, Helen, right at the outset, talked about the ICAR review, and I did want to acknowledge that even before she mentioned it. I would have mentioned it myself. You know, it was hard hitting in the sense that it said, I mean, it said we have not championed women and girls through our spending despite commitments in the International Women and Girls Strategy, and we took that on the chin, and we want to keep improving and keep doing better, and genuinely kind of put our money where our mouth is. You know, there are good things that we're doing, and some of you will be working with and on some of these programs. You know, the Transforming Energy Access program, where we've seen 27,000 green jobs enabled for women, 800 African women supported with job placements in clean energy businesses, and up to 80 women students studying for master's degrees. You know, there are other things that we're doing, and thinking back to COP26 was obviously a very big moment for the UK. You know, at Gender Day, we announced 165 million pounds to tackle climate change and gender inequality. So those are some of the good things that we have done and are doing, but we do need to acknowledge that we need to improve, and we need to go further. So very finally, just to conclude, you know, what are the opportunities? So we know it's a big year for climate finance. We've got the new goal being negotiated and hopefully agreed at COP29. Within the UK, we're going to be going through kind of spending reviews and looking at our plans for the next few years. And we have a new government, which will open up different opportunities. Helen, as I said, highlighted some of the gaps that exist at the moment between our kind of genuine rhetoric and heartfelt rhetoric and current action, and the opportunities are there to you know, to tackle that. Very, very finally, you know, I think Cynthia's presentation highlighted how it's not just about how we channel money into certain types of groups and organisations. There are deep structural issues that need to be addressed around how decisions are made, locally, nationally, and kind of multinationally, and lots of other factors around lives and livelihoods that either constrain or enable women's ability to engage meaningfully in tackling climate change. So I think, you know, the message will be from us to continue to work with the likes of CARE and others, people on the call, people that you're working with, to you know, to help us to genuinely meet the ambition that we've set out, and that the new government, I'm sure, will be setting out in the next few weeks and months. So sorry if I've gone over time. I forgot to look at the start time, but I'm going to stop there and hopefully answer some questions.
That's brilliant. Thanks, David. And exciting to hear that commitment, both to bringing in the local partners, local voices and experience, but also to really shifting the dial and hearing the feedback that you've got through some of the analysis and from the speakers. We do have quite a lot of questions, and my incredible team is supporting me by trying to bring some of those together. If I could ask the panelists, where possible, I know Irene has sometimes some broadband issues, to turn your video on so we can see you, and I'm going to share some questions. I'll do it one at a time. We've got about 15-ish minutes for participants. The webinar was due to finish at 12:45, so got a little bit of time for questions, and then we wanted to ask another survey question, which we hope will be useful for David and his role and team. But let's get going with some questions here. So Cynthia, coming to you. We've had a question of how were older women's experiences captured in the research, and did you see any specific barriers that to do with their identity as being older women?
Great, thank you, Helen, and great question. Indeed, so in engaging with intersectionality, folks who are researchers will understand that there's a gap always between ambition and ability to capture everything. So we focused first on gender and ethnicity, because our homework told us, and our key informants told us this was the big issue. But then we engaged with age and other aspects as they emerged throughout the process. And so one of the things that comes to mind, that older women, not surprisingly, self-identified as facing, in particular, literacy issues and language issues, also technology-related issues, where climate information, of course, is comes in these days increasingly through even social media, education issues as well, in particular in the rural areas of Vietnam, for example, where continuing education for adults requires going to schools, going to places, having the ability to do it, and being flexible enough to do it. So those were some of the issues, and it didn't come up in this study, but in an somewhat related study in Mongolia that we did, ability or disability factored in strongly into the ability of people even to attend meetings, and therefore to be heard and seen, and with aging populations and the correlation with with mobility issues and disability. That didn't come up in this study, but I think it's worth looking at as well, and tackling as part of an inclusive approach to this. Let me stop there. Great question. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Cynthia. I might come back to you. I've got quite a few questions of digging into your research. But I'd like to go to Ireen now. Within the UN FCCC COP, there are gender action plans, gender focal points. What do these people do in reality, and how can we engage with them? Is this approach working? And if not, how could it be improved? Ireen, do you feel able to give that question a go?
Please pardon the question.
Sure. So within the UNFCCC COP, there are gender action plans and gender focal points. What do these people do in reality, and how can we engage with them? Is this approach working? And if not, how could it be improved?
Yeah, thank you very much. Like I have said, and like other speakers have said, we all know that we have good policies, good regulations, good everything on paper, but the factor of implementation is still missing. So while we are discussing on how we can increase the gender participation in these international spaces, we need to look on the fact that the implementation part should be one of the kind that should be emphasized in everything that that we are doing, majorly not leaving the local or the grassroots women behind. They need to come on board to make sure that, because if we don't bring in this intersectionality of grassroots women, leaving their challenges behind, we are not going to achieve what we need, or the number of women attending these conferences is not going to be improved. It will remain the same. Yeah. So we need effective implementation of the policies, especially in the gender action plan, in the NAPs that all countries are drafting to submit this year. Yeah, thanks.
In the national action plans. Yeah, thanks. I'm going to actually go back to Cynthia briefly, Cynthia, because I think it relates to this point. Is women's underrepresentation in climate decision makings, what I'm just reading the question, in climate decision making, any different to underrepresentation in other areas of critical decision making? Like, have you looked, maybe historically at, is what's going on here in climate finance, is there any learnings from other spaces where women have historically been underrepresented, about what we should do about it? Or is it just mirroring the common theme? There's not anything different there? And why? Whatever the answer is. Very briefly, please.
Very, very briefly. That's also a wonderful question. We did look at this a little bit. It's not front of mind, but I will say just very briefly, on the one hand, it is mirroring. As we know, women are underrepresented in government globally. I think women are at something like 26.5% or something, don't quote me on that, of representation in government, but so it mirrors that. But on the other hand, as we saw from the Vietnam example, where Vietnam is already doing better than that global average in government overall, you saw those numbers that were like 16%, 5%, 0% in those central committees. So there actually is, and of course, case by case, there is a possibly more significant gap. And in some ways, I think that has to do with climate coming from a STEM, a technological perspective. It's a techno science and techno politics, and it's increasingly also becoming big money. And so I think that also drives the gap in this space significantly. So yeah, let me stop there. Yeah, and I'd love to hear what folks think about this as well.
Well, welcome any thoughts. I'll go to a question from Mona. Mona, what are the underlying factors that are not normally talked about that undermine women's participation in climate decisions? Is there anything that, is anything more different you want to say about what are the undermining factors that are not normally talked about?
I would say everything that is seen actually all around everywhere is so undermined. So that's why, it's not talked about. We have created a different narrative, be it on image of women, but also their role and all. You did mention of unpaid care work at the very beginning when you were introducing things, which is very much based on the gender role, which is there everywhere. And we do it every day, and we take it so lightly, and we do not understand its impact on underrepresentation of women in any community or climate justice or political or any societal collective action. And when it comes to the entire climate related, climate justice actions also, as women are so much juggling with their gender roles, especially unpaid care work, and actually through that, they are even subsidizing government, because when government is not doing their work, it's women who are actually working for government, and those kind of factors which is so everywhere in our home. We ourselves do it, our mothers, our sisters, our mother-in-laws, sister-in-laws, everyone. However, we have not been able to recognize it, reduce it, redistribute it in a right way so that the representation of women everywhere is ensured. But along with that, many times we do not talk about several gender-based violence, which is induced by climate change also, which remains as an underlying thing, So that's why I also said at the very beginning that climate change is not just the environmental crisis, but also a gender crisis. And it's just because the thing which is just in front of our eyes, we are so not ready to accept it. Also, mostly because men are there in the decision-making level, or people who are in the power holding positions are there all the time. And because they do not want to get rid of it, they try not to see it, or I don't know, created the illusion. So I would say these are it's not that people don't know, but they pretend not to know it or not to see it. And that becomes the underlying, but also the main, isn't in climate justice actions, but also beyond. That's what I would say.
Yes. Yeah. Unpaid care and gender-based violence. I mean, two big topics care finds in our work all over the world, and now being exacerbated by climate change. David, someone from our audience, recognizing that you have a limited amount that you can say about the new government's policy, could you say a bit more about your experience so far working over the last 5 years of why the UK government didn't make more progress on integrating gender equality into climate finance so far, and your experience of addressing the issue of gender equality in international climate finance negotiations? Is there anything more you might be able to share about what's happened over the last 5 years and why we didn't make more progress, and how you're approaching it now?
Yeah, I mean, I can have a go. I mean, it's a really good question, to be honest, and I'm not sure I do have a massively satisfactory answer. So people will probably know, or some people will know that it's a requirement in UK law that we have to consider gender equality in all of our aid programming. So every time we come to design or develop a business case and a program, part of the consideration will be, around, is this advancing gender equality? Are there opportunities to advance gender equality through this work? And the same goes for our climate finance, which at the moment is all ODA. So so at that kind of basic level, I think there is a reasonably good kind of thinking about gender, at least, is well integrated across our development programs. Now, I think the question then is how do we go deeper than that, and how do we get to a point of greater depth? So, I mean, we talked about the ICAI kind of report into our ICF and their comment around us not having championed the role, championed effectively. And I think that's, partly, and like I said, we do take that completely on the chin, but partly that is looking at the kind of at the marker system and some of the more kind of some of the ways that we record how we deliver climate finance. So it's not necessarily telling the whole truth, although it's a good indication that we're not doing as well as we might do. So I think some of it is around some of the stuff, to be honest, that Cynthia and others have talked about, about that greater understanding of the central role that women can and should play in key areas. So I think of an example of around the work that we do in forests and trying to protect forest spaces in the Congo Basin and the Amazon, Indonesia and other places. And a lot of that work will be working with Indigenous groups, Indigenous people, and women in that context who often are, the people who are right at the kind of forefront of deforestation, at the front line, but maybe just not having that kind of depth of understanding of how to really utilize that central role of women in how they deliver that work and deliver that program. So I don't think we're a million miles away. I think the ICAR review was a bit of a wake-up call, and I think as we progress into the kind of the next phase of our climate finance, we would just want to be more deliberative about how we put women and girls at really front and center of that kind of decision making. Look, I mean, we're open to ideas as well. So
brilliant. Well, I hope you'll get more of those from our community here on the webinar. I'm going to go one last question to Mona. To my panelists, you can open the Q&A. I think you can answer in it. My team tells me you can. So if you want to, we haven't been able to answer all the questions. So if you do want to answer in the Q&A, please do if you can, and if not, if you want to answer a question, we can try and match you up with the person afterwards. But I'm going to go to Mona now. Quick 1 minute answer, Mona, or best that you can do. What role can business partnerships play as a stakeholder for collective action and support for more climate finance reaching women and girls and supporting their leadership during times of crisis? I mean, and if anyone else has got a sentence on business partnerships, the corporate sector and how it can help in this area, it would be great to hear those. So Mona, thoughts?
These days we see lots of multilaterals and bilaterals are really funding the corporates and then the private contractors who are really into the climate change and beyond. And we have seen that in Nepal also. There are examples. So there is a whole twist of aid happening. And we know that it is needed also. They should also be the player in this whole effort. And in the entire climate finance related work also, we see their investment around ESG and all those things. However, as I said earlier, let it not just be the annexed or tick box or those kind of effort, but how the money really trickles to the ground. In Nepal, we say jasko sawal usko agwai, meaning those who are facing it should be the one leading it. And whether we have allowed, through our finances, through our effort, through our engagement, the sensitive blueprint effort, whether we have allowed that to happen or not. And the other thing, why we or the business partners only have to be the one who holds knowledge. The knowledge which is there is also equally valid to have a locally led, authentic engagement. Have we really considered that when we are coming up with our blueprints, when we are coming up with our decisions, when we are crafting our initiatives and all. If we do not do that, we are missing that chance again. We are skipping the very important leadership voice, which is definitely of women and girls who are left there at the community, as a marginalized population. So I think that is something which they have to also understand and bring it forth and emphasize. We don't need another gender neutral, gender blind, gender, I don't know, those kind of initiative, and probably not transformative in one go, but at least be responsive in the action is what I would like to say.
Thank you, Mona. Great call to action. So we are coming to the end of our time with you. I've got a couple of things to do. I want to warmly thank my speakers for their incredible insights. I think it's been great to hear examples, especially from Irene and Mona, of how women who are on the front lines of climate change are creating change and leadership already in a meaningful way. But I think we have also heard, how are we going to get these women's experiences, voices, views, ideas into the plans, how we're going to get them financed is still a challenge. And some of those themes we've heard of is around the need to address the structural barriers, harmful norms, gender-based violence, unpaid care work, human trafficking, etc. And how does that link to this? The need for more finance to reach women in communities directly, women's rights organizations, in a way that reflects their demands, needs, experiences, the opportunities coming up. I think some really positive movement that David is sharing, but contextualized with some of the research that we've had from Cynthia that shows it is a very inequitable, is that the correct way, environment. And if we want to change it, we're going to have to be deliberate to try and change it. Otherwise, we're not going to get the kind of response to the climate crisis that will mean that it isn't sexist. So at CARE, we would like to see specific funding for climate and gender equality work from the UK government through climate finance that would be accessible for women's rights organisations. We think a dedicated FCDO program would help advance these approaches and provide a basis to scale up and mainstream greater integration across the climate finance portfolio. We're working with some of you here today, as well as women's rights organisations across the world, to help map out a blueprint for what that might look like for government, but potentially also for the private sector, as alluded to by Mona. We also hope the UK will champion an ambitious new climate finance goal at COP29 to make all of this work possible, including advocating for specific targets on gender equality and finance for women's rights organisations. We'd like to finish by asking you who have participated today another Mentimeter question. Again, you can either click, I think my trusty colleagues are going to share the Mentimeter. Thank you very much. So you can scan the QR code or click open if you'd like to participate. The question is, what in your view is the priority for the UK government to implement to advance this agenda of women's voice and leadership in climate finance? We will endeavour to share what you say with David, but also we'll see it here as a word cloud. So I've got one response. We've got a few minutes to go, so we'd love to hear from you. We went up to over 100 people on the webinar. Had a few leave, but there's still a few of you there. Remove the barriers for women's rights organisations. Flexible funding opportunities. I mean, we know this is a big challenge, making sure those funding opportunities are accessible in a way that they're providing sustainable funding, because these organisations are often put in a starvation cycle with the rules involved in getting access to particularly institutional funding. Gender transformative approaches, more funding for women's-led organisations. Thank you very much. Please feel free to continue to put that in there. We are at time for today. So without further ado, I want to thank you all for attending. We will share the recording. If you'd like to learn more about CARE's work in this space or any other area, please reach out to us. The contacts are in the chat. Follow us online. All social media channels are available. We will be hosting an event at the Labour Party conference to explore how feminist approaches can unlock Foreign Secretary's progressive realism on COP29 later this year, and would love to connect. So please get in touch with the CARE team if you're interested in finding out more. And I'm sure you can find my incredible panel on social media if you'd like to reach out to them. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. It's been great being with you. Take care.